Hi, and welcome to this session, which is an interview with Ros Griffiths. And it's kind of a transition for Lewis and I into a new set of interviews that go to people that are more modern day, I guess, pioneers of community engagement. So I'm going to welcome Ros to just start by perhaps introducing herself and telling us a little bit about herself and perhaps what the interconnecting point and why we might be interviewing you in the context of sort of the IAP2 community engagement picture.
Okay, thank you. My name's Ros Griffiths, and I was born in the London borough of Lambeth and made in Brixton. And how I got involved with the IAP2 course was 14 years ago when I was a practitioner in the field as a community engagement specialist, but I had no framework. I just had ideas of how to engage. I was working on a project to do with young people, and young people were very reluctant to participate in the decision-making process, particularly if it's run by the local authority or local government. And I needed new ways of how to engage them and also for them to participate in a democratic way.
That's great. And look, what I did miss, Ros, was to sort of, get a sense of who you are in terms of how you see yourself as an activist and a community engager and an organizer, and, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. In the 80s, I started out as a community activist campaigning for social change, equality, and all things that meant that we had a better society. In the 90s, I focused my career on being part of change. So I was involved with setting up community projects, grassroots projects that had solutions, social solutions. And the noughties of my career focused on being more about affecting change. So I was a community organizer. And in the latter part, I became more focused on community engagement. And that's my background.
Yeah, great. And look, I suppose, Ros, I've known of you, for quite some time because I know you did training with Tanya in the UK, and I guess I mean, I know about famously what you took from the training, but can you please tell us the story from your perspective of what was your big takeout?
When I joined the course 14 years ago, almost 14 years ago, the IAP2 course, I was looking for something different techniques, concepts of how you engage the community to be part of the decision-making process. I think I was ahead of my time in terms of in London with my peers. I just wanted to do things differently. So when I did the course, my big takeaway was the Simone Circle, the revolving conversation. Straight away, I understood it, and I understood from a participatory perspective. So it wasn't just from a theoretical perspective, it was that I participated. So I knew how it felt to be in that circle and to be moved from that circle. I loved it. And I knew that it was a tool that I could work with. It was a tool that I believe very strongly that um, uh, uh, young people will gravitate to. But I had to be creative. And so I had the tool, but I knew that I had to do a little bit more to make it acceptable for the target group that I was working with, which is young people.
And of course, if people want to listen, that's many of those are recorded and they're under a title of New Talk, and they're absolutely fabulous videos about the topic. Now, I have to sort of say at this point that there's something interesting about the revolving conversation, and that is that it was actually a technique that was initiated by one of the very early kind of pioneers for IAP2, Larry Aggins, and he was a person who suggested this technique, and it's always had a bit of a mixed kind of feeling from people in the community engagement community. Some people love it, some people think, oh, it's a little bit too sort of organic. So I guess I'm really interested in the fact that you kind of adapted it to this sort of target group of particularly young people, and I'm interested in more discussion about that and what you thought sort of would work about that technique in relation to the participation of young people.
What I liked about the technique was that it to me it looked quite edgy and different. It was disrupting the norm, and that was right up my street in terms of doing things differently to get a different result. So rather than have a meeting where you have a panel of experts sit on the top table and the loudest person in the room, captivates the audience, this process allowed people who don't usually feel that they have a voice, find a voice. It felt democratic. It felt that anyone could be in that circle, and it was very empowering. It was revolving. I liked it, and I really saw that this particular target group, young people, could benefit from this process. Because I remember when I was young, I felt like I didn't have a voice. And I wanted to make sure that I found a tool or a process to allow people to have a voice. I remember being young and feeling powerless. So I wanted a process that allowed people to feel that they have power. So even those who always feel that they're powerful because they're leaders, suddenly this process felt that the shift of power was changing. They felt they were losing something. So the process allowed people to think, well, this is a process they can trust. It works. So that you can tap somebody out of the circle, you can join the conversation. Oh, it was amazing. I loved it. And I loved it till this day. I still use that concept, and people love it because at the end of it's revolving, and it's anybody can be in that circle. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be a young person. You could be the prime minister. It is on an even playing field. If you want to be part of that circle, the conversation, you've got to join that circle. Love it.
And look, knowing a little bit about other things that you do, Ros, I think one of the gems in what you've been able to do in relation to this particular technique, but in general, is somehow you've got a skill of actually convincing decision makers to come on the ride with you. Tell us something about that. What do you think? What do you think is your key there?
I think that it's a combination of my qualities as a community organizer. It is about understanding power relations, understanding who has power and how to negotiate power for yourself. So that's with my community organizer's hat on. I learned that very early that powerful people hold on to power. So it was my job to find out how I can negotiate power for myself. But I had to see myself as a leader, an influencer. So I always put myself in a position where I could speak as a leader to leaders about how I can have a seat at the table. And that they recognized that I had added value. I could bring something to the table. And the more I kept doing it, is the more I became very good at it. Because I understand powerful people. I understand leaders in from a perspective that the ability to act. I see myself as a leader producing other leaders. So community engagement was another strand to my bow that allowed me to empower people to be part of the decision-making process, but to create a framework, to create concepts that they trust, understand that there's different levels of engagement. So coming on the IAP2 allowed me to understand that from a framework perspective. I was doing it as a practitioner, not having a framework, but
Yeah.
just going on my gut reaction. And because I was just fearless, because I just needed to know who's in charge, and and I positioned myself where I could be seen and heard and understood, that I'm negotiating for the greater good of the community.
I just think it's just a really interesting point because we've been having a lot of discussions around the spectrum, and one of the key things is that presenting that to decision makers takes some of the fear away, and that's I think what you're sort of hitting on is that somehow you have to kind of make them feel comfortable so that they actually can accept that they can hand over something. So
I think that it's about that outlining the benefits and the value. And once you can outline it in the long term, they will see the benefits, but you have to invest in it. You have to be part of that process. You can't, you have to explain to them you can't do what you've always done and
Right.
expect a different result. So the community engagement wasn't to be feared. And the higher up the chain you are in the organization, they realize that they don't have community engagement as part of the DNA of the organization. That's what I learned. It was more of a function or some specialist area, and it was never going to work if it was seen that way. So someone like myself, the time I've got to who's in charge, they realize that, I understand power relations. And my power base is the people. So I knew the community. I knew how to influence. I knew who the connectors were. I got things done simply because I created a framework that they trusted. So they know me. They call it three circles or circles. I always have a process where their voices could be heard in an organized way, and not in a way that they feel that they're frustrated and angry. No, we'll have a conversation, a dialogue, and that's where it starts, with a dialogue, so that we can hear a different perspective. We understand where you're coming from, and more importantly, how can you become part of the solution?
So it's funny because you just mentioned kind of like the aftermath of the results, and that's kind of where I was heading with my two questions. And one was, you talked a lot about balancing power, and I'm wondering how much participation in those sessions translated to maintaining or improving the imbalance of power situation longer term.
I think in the short term, it did. Because you've got to invest in these processes. This is not something you could do on a wing and a prayer. You have to invest in these processes. It's time consuming, and you definitely have to invest time and resource into it to get the long-term benefits. But what it did change is the feeling. And the feeling was that if you're a senior manager and you're sitting in a circle with somebody from the community who feels that you're not listening to them in terms of the issues that impact on their life, you're now faced with that person who's given you their lived experience of your policies, you know, and just I think it outlines the humanistic aspect, because we're human beings, we feel. And sometimes it starts with a basic dialogue. We need to have a one-to-one. We need to have a conversation about some of your policies that, are impacting on a sort of negative way. So in the short term, for me, it was always a quick win of just starting that conversation, starting that dialogue. And they left that session different.
Mm.
And you wouldn't have got that if you sent a few emails back and forth of how people feel. It's always good to have a one-to-one in an organized way, and hear. Sometimes it is just about listening. That is, I measure that as participation as well. You don't always have to be talking about how you feel. It's about listening. And sometimes senior leaders don't listen.
I think there's a lot to unpack in all that. I mean, but one thing I am a bit interested because you've talked about the three circles and the thing. So just for people that perhaps are not so familiar with the actual technique, and you're talking about adapting the technique as well. Can you just do a quick sort of explanation of, some of the, or the most common way in which you set it up, like physically how you do it in the room?
Okay, well, the concept I was taught on the IAP2 course was two circles. So you have the revolving conversation with the four chairs, and then you have the participatory circle where people leave from that space to enter into the revolving circle. I just added a third circle where those who were not part of the participatory circle, but they wanted to participate via technology. So Twitter or some social media. So I was able to capture those voices. That's how I came up with three circles. So began to evolve. I use, because it was young people, instead of having minute takers, I had people who could do graffiti, who can capture the themes of what was discussed. I got the session. I had the session recorded, so it was more qualitative in its data to analyze, as opposed to a scientific approach to, analyzing that data. And people felt that their voices were heard because you had somebody capturing those themes in an interactive way, a fun way. And when you're working with young people, they some of their attentions were limited, so I had to be creative how I captured their imagination on some of the ideas and concepts that they came up with in discussion. With young people, they're either giving you a message through dance, they will rap to you, or they will be very artistic. And I had to capture all of that because it is a message, it's a form of communication. And I think that's how the circles, the Simone circles allowed me to be creative, keep evolving it, keep it interesting, keep it fresh, and keep it relevant.
And probably the key thing to say about it is that it's a leaderless meeting, and it's always when there's a leaderless meeting, and I introduce this idea of this concept, people go, yeah, but who's going to take charge? Who's going to facilitate it? Who's going to, it's always so, and I think that's the key element that you're saying in why it's successful with people that perhaps aren't on the mainstream in terms of participation.
Yes, and I think that frightens people when you say it's leaderless and it's revolving. They just cannot conceptualize it until they see it. Then it becomes quite addictive. You participate. It's very addictive. One thing for sure, when they enter the circle, it's hard to get them to stop talking, to move on to the next subject, because they want more, and and depending who's in the circle, it changes the dynamics. It's fun. It's great.
I talking to Larry, I know his main thrust of the technique was, how do you take 100 people or 200 people and have a conversation? And the main genius of it was, you don't have 100 people talk. You have 4 people talk, and it's face to face, and it's eyeball to eyeball, and it's very personal. But you made me realize something today I hadn't really thought of before, and that was, the most powerful conversations are almost always stories. And in my own experience, limited experience, frankly, of using the revolving conversation, that's what happens all the time. Now, occasionally you get somebody that'll spout data or, statistics or whatever, but that never moves anybody. It's always the lived experience stories that really land, So I really appreciate you sharing that.
And just to add that I come from a culture of storytellers. And so mum my parents would tell a story of the stories that they were told, and it goes on. So it was it's now in 2024, storytelling is big business, you know, because that's what wins hearts and minds. You've got to tell that story because that's what captures people's attention. It's not great presentations and PowerPoints, and it's about the story. They want to know what's the story? How did you get to this point? And when you tell them the story, they are moved because we're human beings. We have a heart, we feel. And, you know, this process of the revolving circle allows people to just to tell a story about how they feel. And that's where the lived experience comes in. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of strategies and policies. It's always about the theoretical approach, which is fine, but it's not good enough. You need to have the lived experience to underpin that, so that we can say, okay, you know, that we have the frameworks, we've got the theory, and we have the lived experience. Put that together. That's what makes it powerful. And I think that I found this through this whole process of the revolving circle.
So we talked about the fact that there were some innovations involved, and you shared one, the third circle. Are there any other, you know, innovations or adaptations that you've used to make it successful, particularly again with your target audience, and or other techniques that you've kind of married up with it that would be interesting to share with the people who see?
How I made it more innovative is that I added rap artists, so that they will be part of the discussion, and then they will turn the themes that come out of this discussion into a rap piece. So some of the young people would turn the whole discussion into a rap piece. They will sit there, write up their lyrics, and then summarized with a rap piece. And that was the innovation piece, as well as the graffiti artists who will come up with a finished artwork at the end of it for everyone to go and look at, take pictures, put it on social media. It was fantastic. So they went away with a lasting experience. It wasn't just, you know, it lived on beyond the session.
You know what I love, Margie, is everything we know about human beings tells us that the emotions are really where it happens in terms of whether people can change their minds or find a different perspective. It's not done through the data, it's not done through information. And I just think it's fabulous, Ros, that not only have you used conversation to do that, rapping is storytelling, you know, graffiti is storytelling. I mean, the whole thrust of this is blowing my mind, is about storytelling, which we know is the strongest way to land with people.
So in other words, I just metamorphosized it. I just merged it together. So I learned the technique. I understood my target group, and I understood what the spaces that they communicate in, and I just put it all together, and that's how I came up with the new talk. So they felt it was fresh, relevant, and you know, the institutions, you know, they were marveled. So that's, I think, from there, my career in community engagement started 14 years ago. After I learned that technique, I just did it all the time. It was my secret weapon.
Ros, yeah, we talked a lot about how you adapted this beautifully to the target audience of the youth as a way of getting their voice heard. But it would have been, as they say, the sound of one hand clapping if the decision makers don't show up. And I imagine, as you said, there was resistance and a little bit of fear of like, what am I getting myself into? I'm losing control.
Yeah.
But you keep saying that they keep coming back to you because they get results. And could you expand a little bit what did they consider results that's worth their time?
Um, because the people that I put in the circles are the people who don't normally get that access to the community. So they're very senior. That we're talking about senior management, directors, senior leaders. Because if I could get the prime minister in a circle, I will do. That's how I work as a community organizer. Who's in charge? Who sets the policy? Who's responsible for, the strategy? And put them in the circle. Once they participate and get the experience, it can't be undone. So once they got that feeling of, well, this is great. This made me feel a little bit uncomfortable because when you have a 14-year-old in the circle with, the chief of police about his policing methods and strategies, this is lived experience. This is not an email or his other officers explaining. He's had a conversation, that he wouldn't otherwise have. So I think once they have that first-hand experience, they go away feeling different and they want more. It made them feel uncomfortable, but they were happy to participate and have that conversation. And that's what it was about, having that dialogue. So yes, they felt how I felt when I first participated, because looking at it looks good, but when you participate, it's a different experience, because you want to stay in that circle because you want to hold on to power. But when somebody taps you on that shoulder and you go, it's the rules. You got to leave. So
This has
yes,
been fabulous, Roz. Thank you so much for taking your time to sit with us today and talk with us. And it's an exciting new start to our new phase of pioneers in the field. Margie, you have anything you want to say?
No, I just probably want to just reiterate that sadly we lost Larry Aggins last year, and he was the pioneer of this particular technique, and so I just want to pay tribute to him as part of this interview. And thank you, Ros. You are truly an inspiration. You're a true leader, and it's been, a great pleasure to meet you and have a continuing relationship with you. And it's really great to be able to interview you today.
well, thank you, and I really enjoyed sharing my experience around this subject. And I'm passionate about this area of work. So it's a pleasure to share. And I think that I'm just part of that legacy of the creator who came up with this concept. So change is coming, and I'm glad that I was part of change.